They laughed at her backpack, old straps, dried stains, barely holding together. No one noticed how she held it like a shield or a warning. The room was still joking when the instructor froze, because the blood seal on that fabric meant only one thing. Humanity had already survived something no one else had. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe for more unforgettable HFY stories, and comment if you noticed the seal before he did. They noticed the backpack before they noticed her. It sagged against her shoulder like it had lived too long, straps frayed, fabric dulled by years of abrasion that no synthetic polish could hide. In a hall filled with polished alloy armor, adaptive shields, and bio-enhanced gear, humming softly with energy, it looked almost insulting. A relic. A joke. When she stepped into the training chamber late, the automated doors sealing behind her with a hiss, several cadets turned at once and smirked. The laughter started small. A clicking sound from one species, a sharp exhale from another. Someone didn't even bother lowering their voice, commenting on how humans still carried things instead of integrating them. Another wondered aloud if the bag was filled with food rations and sentimental nonsense. A third suggested it might fall apart if exposed to real pressure. None of them were subtle. None of them were worried. She didn't respond. She moved with measured steps, not hurried, not apologetic, scanning the space as if she were entering unfamiliar terrain rather than a classroom. Her eyes flicked briefly to the ceiling, then to the corners, then to the exits. She chose a seat near the wall, back protected, line of sight unobstructed. Only then did she lower the backpack to the floor, keeping one hand looped casually through a strap as if it were habit rather than intent. The instructor continued speaking without pause, a tall, plated figure whose species had never lost a homeworld and made sure everyone knew it. His lecture was about tactical theory, about efficiency curves and casualty thresholds. Humans, he mentioned briefly, fell into the high-loss, low-yield category historically. A few cadets glanced at her again, emboldened now. One mimicked the way she held the bag, cradling it like something precious. Another leaned over and asked if humans were allowed to bring personal items into combat training. She didn't look at them. Her breathing stayed even. Her fingers rested near the clasp of the bag, thumb brushing a notch worn smooth by repetition. The instructor finally acknowledged her presence with a flick of his gaze. He noted her lateness, her lack of standard equipment, the absence of a visible combat interface. His tone was dismissive, instructional rather than curious. He asked her to state her designation for the record. She did, quietly, voice steady, without embellishment. The name meant nothing to the room. That, too, earned a ripple of amusement. As she settled fully into stillness, the laughter softened but didn't disappear. The room returned to half attention, half contempt. To them, she was already categorized: fragile species, outdated tools, misplaced confidence. The backpack remained the focal point. It seems rough, its surface marked by stains that no one bothered to examine closely. Dried, darkened patches that blended into the fabric, easy to dismiss as rust or grime. Except they weren't rust. The instructor moved down the aisle as he spoke, emphasizing a point about preparedness, about trusting one's equipment. He gestured broadly, tapping a cadet's gleaming shield generator with approval, praising redundancy and fail-safes. When he reached her row, he slowed, eyes flicking to the bag almost against his will. His gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary. Something about it disrupted the rhythm of his lecture. He leaned closer, curiosity finally overcoming disdain. The symbol was small, half hidden beneath a stitched repair. A circle broken by angled lines, scorched into the fabric rather than printed. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't symmetrical in the way fashion favored. It looked deliberate, burned with precision, darkened by age. And it wasn't alone. Faint traces suggested others had once been there, overlapping, removed, or worn away. The instructor stopped speaking mid-sentence. The room noticed the silence before they noticed his reaction. He straightened slowly, posture stiff, mandibles tightening. One of his hands lifted, then hovered uncertainly, as if he'd intended to point something out, but no longer trusted his own intent. The ambient hum of the room seemed louder in the pause. A cadet snorted, breaking the quiet, asking what the problem was. Another joked that maybe the human's bag was finally shedding. Laughter followed, thinner this time. The instructor didn't join them. He stared at the mark, eyes narrowing, then widening just enough to betray recognition. His breathing changed, a subtle hitch that only those trained to read threat responses would catch. His hand trembled once before he clenched it into a fist behind his back. The human felt the shift before anyone said anything. She adjusted her grip on the strap, not defensively, but with a kind of readiness that suggested this moment had always been expected. She kept her gaze forward, expression neutral, giving him the choice to continue or to ask. He took a step back, creating distance where moments before he'd assumed dominance. His voice, when he spoke again, was lower, slower. He asked her where she had acquired that marking. She answered without hesitation. She didn't offer a story, didn't justify it. She named a place, a designation long since removed from public archives. A zone most of the cadets had never heard of because the records ended abruptly and without explanation. A murmur rippled through the room, curiosity replacing mockery. Someone whispered that humans exaggerated everything. Another insisted it was probably ceremonial, some cultural thing. The instructor raised a hand, silencing them instantly. That alone shocked the room. He had never cut them off for a human before. He looked at her then, really looked, not at her size or her lack of visible enhancements, but at the way she sat, the way her shoulders aligned, the way she didn't fidget under scrutiny. His gaze dropped again to the backpack, to the seal, to the stains that suddenly looked less like neglect and more like residue. He swallowed. For the first time since she entered, the power balance shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but irreversibly. The laughter died completely. The cadets sensed it, even if they didn't understand it yet. Something in the room had changed, something old and dangerous had brushed against their assumptions. The human remained still, hand on the bag, eyes forward. And the instructor, hands no longer steady, realized that what they'd mocked wasn't outdated equipment at all. It was proof. The instructor didn't answer immediately. He remained standing beside her desk, eyes locked on the scorched symbol as if it might move when unobserved. The room waited. Even the most arrogant cadets sensed that pressing the moment would be a mistake. What had begun as curiosity was turning into something closer to unease. That mark, he said finally, voice measured but strained, is not issued lightly. A few cadets shifted, interest sharpening. One leaned forward, whispering that it looked primitive, that burning fabric was inefficient. Another muttered that humans loved symbolism. The instructor's head snapped toward the sound, mandibles clicking once in warning. Silence fell again, heavier this time. He straightened and addressed the room, but his eyes kept returning to the backpack. He explained that blood seals were not awards, not unit insignia, not cultural tokens. They were emergency classifications used only when command authority collapsed entirely, when evacuation failed, when survival doctrine no longer applied. A blood seal meant the bearer had operated beyond all support frameworks, beyond reinforcement, beyond acceptable loss parameters. A cadet raised a hand, confused, asking why such a thing would be burned into personal equipment. The instructor hesitated before answering. Because nothing else survived long enough to carry it. Because synthetic casings melted, data slates corrupted, embedded interfaces failed. Organic fabric endured. It absorbed. It remembered. The human did not react. She had heard this explanation before, in rooms far smaller and far more damaged than this one. The difference was that here, the words unsettled an audience that had never needed them. The instructor continued, more reluctantly now. Blood seals were registered only after confirmation of total zone failure. Entire battalions erased. Fleet presence withdrawn. A seal indicated that the individual carrying it had not merely survived, but had adapted without doctrine, without oversight, without resupply. It meant the rules had broken first. A ripple of disbelief passed through the cadets. Someone scoffed quietly, saying no single soldier could be certified under such conditions. Another argued that any species could survive briefly in chaos. The instructor turned slowly, fixing them with a stare that ended the argument before it began. Survival, he said, was not measured in hours, or days, or lucky escapes. Survival was measured in outcomes. He tapped a control on his wrist, projecting a faint holographic list into the air. Most entries were redacted, species names obscured, dates erased. Only classifications remained. There were very few blood seals recorded in the Academy's history. Fewer still associated with humans. Each carried a casualty index, so high it bordered on theoretical impossibility. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. The instructor explained that humanity had entered galactic records late and violently. Their early encounters were not diplomatic successes. Their colonies had been underestimated, written off as expendable frontier experiments. When conflicts escalated, response times lagged. When evacuations were ordered, they often arrived too late. Human doctrine adjusted. Not by reinforcement, but by compression. Smaller units. Fewer resources. Higher tolerance for loss. Someone asked why this wasn't common knowledge. The instructor's answer was simple. Because it frightened allies as much as enemies. A species that could continue fighting without command, without logistics, without hope of extraction destabilized strategic models. Humanity did not fit into predictive frameworks. So their records were sealed, their certifications quietly archived. His gaze dropped again to the backpack. He pointed out details the cadets hadn't noticed before. The stitching wasn't random. It followed stress patterns, reinforcing tear points that only appeared after prolonged exposure to corrosive atmospheres. The patches weren't decorative. They covered breaches from shrapnel and claw and directed energy. Each repair overlapped the last. Not because it was sloppy, but because there had been no time to remove the old damage before the next. The stains, he said quietly, were not from a single incident. They layered over one another, absorbed into the fibers until the fabric itself had changed composition. Some of it, he noted with visible discomfort, was not human blood. A few cadets recoiled. One asked why she was allowed to carry it at all. The instructor didn't answer immediately. Then he said that blood-sealed equipment was never confiscated. Not by protocol. Not by custom. It belonged to the survivor, and in some doctrines, to the dead who hadn't made it out. The human finally spoke, voice even, clarifying a point without emotion. The backpack wasn't issued to her. It had been assembled over time. Pieces scavenged. Straps replaced. Compartments added. It wasn't designed for efficiency. It was designed to endure being wrong. Wrong plans. Wrong assumptions. Wrong odds. The instructor nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than approval. He explained to the room that blood seals also served as warnings. Not to enemies, but to commanders. They indicated that the bearer would not wait for orders that never came. Would not prioritize extraction over mission completion. Would not break when doctrine failed, because doctrine was no longer relevant. A cadet asked, carefully now, how many humans carried such seals. The instructor hesitated. Then he said the number was statistically insignificant and strategically disproportionate. The weight of that settled heavily. He concluded by stating that anyone who mocked such equipment had misunderstood its purpose. It was not a sign of poverty or backwardness. It was a record, a ledger written in fabric and blood and repair. And the fact that it sat quietly on the floor of an academy classroom meant that whatever had created it, whatever had killed everyone else who carried similar marks, had not been enough to stop her. The instructor stepped back, creating space again, but this time it was not dismissal. It was respect edged with caution. The cadets didn't laugh anymore. They didn't whisper. They watched her with new eyes, trying to reconcile the unassuming human with the implications of what they'd just learned. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The seal had already spoken for her. The instructor didn't waste another moment on debate. He announced an immediate tactical evaluation, one that would test cadets in conditions approaching failure thresholds. The room shifted, alien students adjusting to the sudden change with practiced anticipation, confident in their shields, their coordinated reflexes, their predictive algorithms. Humans, the instructor added silently, were supposed to struggle. The test began. Systems activated, and a chamber transformed from theoretical constructs into active threat simulations. Hazard indicators blinked, environmental controls fluctuated, automated opposition emerged. Cadets moved in squads, relying on communication nodes, adaptive armor, and pre-programmed strategies. They were swift, efficient, predictable. They underestimated the human. She assessed silently, scanning patterns, calculating risk in her mind as she had countless times before. She didn't reach for energy shields or deploy tech interfaces. Her fingers adjusted straps, unclasped compartments, and retrieved simple, manual tools. Analog light emitters, multi-use cutting instruments, reinforced cables. Nothing exotic. Everything functional. Everything durable. A sudden alarm triggered an unexpected environmental collapse. Gravity shifted erratically. Atmospheric filters failed. Weaponized drones malfunctioned and collided. Panic flared among cadets. Shields flickered, psychics strained to maintain cohesion. Dozens of variables converged into chaos. The human responded instantly, her body moving with practiced economy. She placed a light source to mark safe zones, created trip lines with cables to redirect drones, manually stabilized collapsing nodes. Cadets who relied on technology froze or stumbled. One alien's shield overheated, sparking dangerously. Another lost connection with their psychic partner, leaving them exposed. She reached without hesitation, pulling both to safety with precision. She didn't speak, didn't ask for thanks, didn't signal authority. Every action was calculation, instinct, and experience distilled into motion. Observers saw patterns emerge. She didn't just react, she predicted. She anticipated failure points that no manual could teach, that no algorithm could calculate. She improvised, adapting the environment to her advantage rather than attempting to control it. Cadets tried to follow their doctrine, repeating sequences designed for predictable threats, only to find them failing spectacularly. Their coordinated tactics broke down under irregular pressure, while she exploited inconsistencies flawlessly. The instructor observed quietly, his earlier unease solidifying into a realization. This was not mere survival. It was dominance through adaptability. The human operated with no support, no hierarchy, no expectation of rescue. Where cadets relied on networks, she relied on principles. Where they froze under error, she pressed forward with purpose. Where they feared loss, she calculated risk as a tool. She moved through the chamber with efficiency, her backpack a constant presence. It wasn't ornamental. Compartments contained tools scavenged for versatility. Straps bore evidence of repairs under duress. Every patch, every burn mark, every smear of dried matter represented a problem solved, an obstacle overcome, a scenario survived. She did not announce it. She simply lived it. The seal on the fabric signified more than history. It was operational doctrine embodied. Cadets who had mocked her now watched with growing comprehension. The human's actions were coherent, deliberate, and effective in ways that bypassed all standard logic. Systems intended to simulate extreme scenarios could not predict her behavior. Algorithms failed. Shields were bypassed. Coordination broke. She turned disadvantage into leverage, chaos into order, and improvised tools into instruments of survival. The instructor could no longer mask respect behind caution. His hand twitched as he observed, unconsciously noting every minor adjustment she made, every subtle calculation in her eyes. He had trained thousands of cadets from multiple species, yet none had approached this level of instinctive mastery under unpredictable conditions. None had treated failure as a vector rather than a barrier. By the end of the exercise, the chamber was still functional, but marked by subtle signs of disruption. Cadets were shaken, physically unharmed but mentally rattled. They realized they had relied too heavily on protocols and systems. The human had succeeded without either. She had not only survived the simulation but had optimized it, converting its inherent dangers into a sequence of managed outcomes. Her presence alone recalibrated the perceived difficulty of every scenario. The instructor finally spoke, his voice measured but devoid of hesitation. He commended the class on participation, though his tone betrayed the true lesson. The human had rewritten their understanding of individual capability. Cadets looked to her with awe, confusion, and a hint of fear. They had been trained to depend on resources, on hierarchy, on coordination. She had demonstrated that none of these were essential. Adaptation and resolve were. She did not celebrate. She did not comment. She returned her backpack to its original position, straps secured, patches aligned. Every movement reinforced calm, control, and purpose. The instructor allowed the moment to linger, acknowledging that her success was not a fluke or luck. It was deliberate. It was principle. It was human. The room's atmosphere shifted permanently. What began as a tactical exercise had revealed a truth cadets could not unsee. Systems doctrine, numerical advantage, they were secondary to adaptability, to foresight, to a willingness to endure and improvise under conditions designed to break any protocol. The human had taught them, without instruction, that survival alone was insufficient. Mastery came from transforming every failure into a step forward. The instructor's hands no longer trembled in fear, but in recognition. He understood that the implications of this exercise would echo far beyond the chamber. Humanity was not just unpredictable. Humanity was operationally superior when stripped of support. Cadets absorbed this lesson silently, some with disbelief, others with grudging respect. She had proven that the human principle of resilience was not theoretical, not anecdotal. It was actionable, efficient, and lethal in its own right. In a room filled with advanced technologies and species bred for combat, one individual had demonstrated that preparation, ingenuity, and determination could eclipse every advantage they had relied upon. The test ended not because she failed, nor because the cadets succeeded, but because the simulation itself could no longer contain her. By the time the instructors deactivated the chamber, she had already accounted for every variable, secured every threat, and left an indelible mark on the understanding of those present. Every cadet and observer now knew something they could not ignore. The human was not just surviving, they were redefining the rules of engagement, quietly, efficiently. The room was silent. The cadets who had laughed and whispered earlier now avoided her gaze, sensing something profound had shifted. The instructor stood with his hands clasped, voice measured but carrying weight he could no longer disguise. He addressed her directly, using terms reserved for the most distinguished species, the few who had survived events no doctrine could prepare them for. There was no exaggeration, no pretense. He spoke only the truth. The blood seal on her backpack was proof. She had been the last survivor in a zone where all others had fallen, where every rule, every expectation, every calculated plan had failed, and yet she had endured. The seal was not symbolic. It was certification of survival under conditions no one else could withstand. The cadets absorbed this quietly. Shock, disbelief, and respect mingled on their faces. Some were unable to reconcile her unassuming appearance with the magnitude of what she had endured. The backpack they had mocked now seemed almost sacred. Each patch, each burn, each layer of dried matter carried a story of survival, loss, and resilience. The human had walked through circumstances designed to obliterate entire squads, and she had emerged intact, carrying not just herself, but the evidence of human endurance. The instructor continued, explaining that humans did not survive through technology alone. They survived through adaptability, through anticipation, through principles that no simulation could replicate. A human would expect failure and plan for it, transform disadvantage into advantage, and endure beyond the limits other species accepted as absolute. The cadets had witnessed this in action. Every miscalculation, every environmental hazard, every system failure had been absorbed, adapted to, and turned into an opportunity by her alone. She adjusted the straps of her backpack calmly, methodically, as if this recognition had always been expected. There was no arrogance, no display of superiority. She carried the evidence of survival quietly, almost reverently. Inside the backpack were tools, supplies, and a ledger of those who had not survived. It was a record not of conquest, but of responsibility. Each name, each stain, each repair was a testament to human endurance, a reminder that survival was not merely about self-preservation, but about carrying forward the legacy of those who had fallen. The cadets began to understand, slowly, the weight of what they had witnessed. Their technology, their shields, their psychic coordination, none of it mattered if they lacked the principle that she had demonstrated. The human mind, when tested to its extreme, could improvise, endure, and master situations that rigid doctrine could not anticipate. They had trained to react, to depend on systems, to execute strategy. She had taught them that adaptability, foresight, and resolve were superior. The instructor's voice softened as he acknowledged her formally to the room. Humanity would no longer be evaluated merely as recruits. They would be observed as force multipliers, unpredictable yet decisive. Cadets who had mocked her earlier now looked at her with a mixture of awe and caution. Every previous assumption about the limits of human capability had been overturned in a matter of hours. Her presence alone had recalibrated the Academy's understanding of what was possible. She remained composed, not seeking recognition, not demanding accolades. Her calm demeanor reinforced the lesson she had imparted. That true strength did not require announcement, that mastery could exist in quiet action rather than spectacle. The backpack, once a source of ridicule, now symbolized endurance, knowledge, and the quiet authority of experience. Every mark on it was a lesson, every patch a testament, every stain a proof that humans could survive and adapt beyond all expectation. Cadets watched her rise, noting the purposeful precision of her movements. She walked with steady confidence, carrying the weight of her experiences effortlessly. The instructor allowed her to lead the way, knowing that the path she chose was informed by knowledge they could not yet grasp. One by one, the cadets followed, not because they were instructed to, but because instinct told them this was the correct response. Respect had replaced mockery, understanding had replaced doubt. The human silence spoke louder than any words. Her actions, her endurance, and the seal she carried had demonstrated a principle that no simulation, no protocol, no technological advantage could replicate. Humanity persevered through adversity, thrived through adaptation, and commanded respect not through dominance, but through proof. The lesson was clear. The blood seal had spoken. The cadets understood instinctively that the rules had changed, that one human had shown them the limits of their own assumptions. The instructor's hands trembled once more, this time not in fear but in acknowledgement. He realized that this moment, this single demonstration of human capability, would ripple through the academy for years to come. The mockery had ended. Recognition had begun. Humanity had quietly asserted itself, not with grand declarations, but with evidence that no one could ignore. The room, once filled with laughter and derision, now stood in reverent silence. She carried the backpack with measured grace, each step deliberate, each motion a reminder that survival was both a burden and a responsibility. The cadets, the instructor, and the entire chamber had witnessed something extraordinary, the embodiment of human resilience, principle, and ingenuity. It was not a victory proclaimed, it was a truth revealed. And as she walked forward, leading without speaking, the unspoken acknowledgement spread. Humans did not merely survive. Humans endured, adapted, and redefined the limits of possibility.